My name is Cari Clark. I, along with Sharon Watkins, we are your co-host for the Chez Zee author series, which we started several years ago. My day job, I am a realtor with Sotheby's International, and this is kind of my passion project that I can't believe I get to do this every month. And of course, today, why we're all here, is we have Sarah Bird. And she's got lots of friends in the house and lots of fans, obviously. You probably all know that Sarah is the author of 10 novels, including Above the East China Sea, The Gap Year, How Perfect Is That?, The Mommy Club, and and The Alamo House. Bodice Rippers. And she was our guest, I guess it was last year, and we had a wonderful visit. We talked about both Over the East China Sea and her book, A Love Letter to Texas Women, which is a wonderful book. Speaking of books, we have her latest novel is for sale. You can buy it at the bar, and then after we're finished, we're going to have Sarah signing books up here. So if you'll just form a line after we're finished. We'll talk about 45 minutes, and then I'll open it up for questions. Tonight, we are going to be talking about Sarah's most recent work, and I'm sure you've all heard about it, Daughter of a Queen. It was just published last month.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Can everybody hear me? Am I mic'd correctly?
It's good.
Is that good? No. Yes, no. Should I just hold it up to my
Here,
mouth?
I can give you this if you
I can hold it like this,
Okay.
huh? How about this? Is this working?
Okay, I don't know why it's not working.
No, I'm not a super projector. Carry on.
Okay,
Carry.
so
Carry.
so let's start to get, maybe not everybody's read the novel, so I'd like for you to start with a kind of a summary about the novel. Tell us a little bit about this novel.
First of all, clearly this is going to be a civil debate. We're going to maintain our civility because she didn't mention my nickname, Lion Sarah. And it's stuck because it's true. Sorry, my head is just so filled with this. So this novel, I'm going to give you the capsule of who this novel is about. It's based on a true story of a woman named Kathy Williams who was enslaved on a grim tobacco farm in western Missouri. She was born in 1842. At the start of the Civil War, General Sheridan's troops swept across that area and were liberating the slaves, carrying them away from the plantations, and she was liberated at that time. In reality, this occurred very early in the Civil War, 1861. In the novel, I sped it up essentially because I did not want to write a Civil War novel. So she then, in reality, spends 4 years of the Civil War cooking and doing laundry for General Sheridan's staff. During this period, of course, she would have seen the magnificent sight of an African-American man in uniform participating in the struggle for liberation. At the end of the Civil War, and this is kind of an image I like to put in people's head of what the South was like at the end of the Civil War, in particular since she had been with Sheridan. And one of the great gifts from history to me is that she maintained a lifelong relationship with General Philip Sheridan, who was one of the three great major generals on the Union side of the Civil War. And he was responsible for the Shenandoah campaigns. And this was a version, as Sherman did throughout Georgia, of total war. And he is sometimes credited with introducing this concept of total war, which was devastation on a massive scale, involvement of civilians, and just leaving utter destruction in his wake. So the goal of the Shenandoah campaigns was to shut down what was called the breadbasket of the South. So he accomplished this there at Appomattox. And as I say, at that point, the South is essentially a smoldering graveyard. And for a woman, an uneducated woman of any race, there are desperately few options. She could have continued to serve as a cook or a laundress. She could have married a sharecropper. She could have been a prostitute. All of these choices would have essentially been a return to servitude at this time. And so Kathy made what I consider the magnificent choice of saying no to all these horrible options. And instead, she disguised herself as a man and enlisted in the Buffalo Soldiers and served for 2 years in the Buffalo Soldiers. That's the historical basis of the novel.
Shakespeare.
So there's a lot of, yeah. So this is the basis of the story. So can you tell us what part of this is fact and how much of this is fiction?
I made some, first of all, the essential thing to understand about all the Buffalo Soldiers is, well, virtually all the Buffalo Soldiers, is they were by and large taken from the ranks of the formerly enslaved at the end of the Civil War. 6 regiments of what were called colored troops were formed. And the Buffalo Soldiers, by and large, were illiterate because it had been illegal, as you know, for slaves to learn how to read. So there is pitifully little documentation about the Buffalo Soldiers in general, and virtually none about Kathy Williams, aside from, and I'll get into this later, but pretty much everything we know about Kathy Williams is on the internet. You can read it in 20 minutes and learn. But I'm trying to decide. I don't want to go off without the right background to talk about what I changed, what I didn't change.
Like, for example, do we know if she was in the cavalry or in the infantry?
We know that she was in the infantry. She was a foot soldier.
Okay.
And this has to do with how I first found out about Kathy's story.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and tell us that?
And it's settle in. It's a long story. This is a 40-year story, and I will try to keep it short, but it's a long story. I first heard about, to me, this mind-blowing story of Kathy Williams in 1978. I had graduated from the University of Texas in '76 with a graduate degree in journalism, but I specialized in photojournalism. And so I was at that time looking for what all journalists, all photographers look for, and that is the untold story and the unseen image. I fell in love with rodeos. First of all, just regular mainstream rodeos of that sort right there. But then I discovered what I started to think of as rodeos of the other. And these were all these various subcultures who had taken mainstream rodeo and remade it in their own image. So I photographed charreadas, I photographed Native American rodeos, kids rodeos, women's rodeos, prison police rodeos, gay rodeos, my husband's favorite, because it was like, at no other rodeo has anyone ever offered me a daiquiri in the men's room. And he was wearing a peignoir. I said, I'm with you. There's nothing not to love about this scenario. Also, heard about a nudist rodeo, held, of course, in California. Exactly my reaction. No, you look at you like she's going like this. Never got close enough to that one to learn the true definition of bareback riding or rawhide. So, but the ones I really, really loved were the African American rodeos. These were jubilant, joyous community affairs typically held around Juneteenth was the big one. That was the major one of the year, when the celebration of Juneteenth. When and I went to places like Plum and Egypt and El Campo and the Diamond L Arena on South Main in Houston. And it was actually at the Diamond L in 1978 that I was photographing these very handsome cowboys on their very handsome mounts, and got to talking to them, and they were the first to tell me the story of Kathy Williams. So this was 1978, and it electrified me. So I began researching. Fortunately, we live here with this world-class library system, the University of Texas, and I dug through the card catalogs, haunted the stacks. Could find very, very little, as I say, on the Buffalo Soldiers, and absolutely nothing on Kathy Williams or any female Buffalo Soldier. So I assumed that the story was apocryphal, that it wasn't true, and I was very sad about this, but I put it aside and didn't think a lot about it until 1988. I was pregnant, and I went to childbirth classes with a wonderful woman named Pam Black. Second class, Pam came up to me and she told me, during the day, I'm a teacher at a predominantly black school, and we do not have enough stories about heroes who look like our kids, particularly the girls. I've been doing a bit of research on this topic, and I found a great story that I think you should write as a novel. And I said, P.S. Writer's least favorite words. You should write this. You should. I've got a great story for you. And then she said, it's the story of a woman after the Civil War, Kathy Williams, who disguised herself as a man. I said, gosh, Pam, I too love that story. I've researched it, and sorry, doesn't exist. Not a true story. And Pam looked at me and said, oh, really? And the next class, she brought me copies of Kathy's enlistment papers, her discharge papers, application for a pension, and it just riveted me, this story. I think I related to it for many reasons. First of all, just as this great untold American story, like why had I never heard this before? And also I related to it because I grew up in a military family. I grew up in an Air Force family, traveling around the world, and so not only was my father a warrior, but my mother was. So I'm the daughter of two warriors. My parents met at a barn dance in North Africa, where my mother was serving as a nurse and accompanied the troops through North Africa up, the liberation of the invasion of Sicily, liberation of Italy, over to France. And so she told me all her stories, and I grew up seeing my dad get all sorts of decorations for his hair, and he deserved them. He flew aerial reconnaissance over what we used to call Red China and Soviet Union, and then Nazi Germany during the war. But honestly, until I really got into Kathy's story, it never occurred to me that my mom at no point had ever, not only not been decorated, she was never recognized as a veteran, but this was very, very, that was the way it was until quite recently. So I felt this, on many levels, I felt this obligation to tell Kathy's story. At the same time, I felt a lot of hesitation about it and thought that ideally this story should be told by an African American woman. And I was also certain that it would be, because at that time it had started to appear on the internet. And so I said, it's just a matter of time till it comes out. And so I waited, and meantime, Kathy started talking to me. She was asking me questions like, why does everybody know who Annie Oakley is and nobody knows who I am? What did Annie Oakley ever do? She shot over her shoulder and did sharpshooting tricks. I go, I'm sorry, it'll happen soon. It didn't. A few years after, I had her existence confirmed, I was at dinner with a friend of mine at Clarksville Cafe, if anybody remembers that place. And if you remember, Joan remembers. Do you remember they like had, for some reason, had long red velvet curtains that hung from certain little corners. If you got off in a little corner, they'd be like, so we were off, my friend Emily and I were off in a corner, and so I had red velvet curtains hanging down from me, this kind of cozy little, it was a bit like a seance, and my friend Emily is known to some as a psychic. As I said, I came from journalism, so I was kind of hostile to that sort of stuff, professional skeptic kind of thing. And as we're eating dinner, Emily, her eyes keep fluttering up in her head, and I go, oh, please, no. I'm not the audience for this, whatever's happening. And she said, I'm sorry, Sarah, but there's been a woman standing behind you throughout dinner. And I said, oh, really? And so, has a woman you love died? And I go, oh gosh, Emily, like probably 100% of the population, yes. I've had that experience. No, I'm sorry, Sarah. And then she said, she died, I don't know, at least 100 years ago, and I cannot explain the image I'm getting, but I see silver doors opening at the top of your head, and she's pouring something into it. I don't know what it is. And I said, oh my God, it's her story. So at that point, I said, I surrender. And this was a couple years after I had adapted my second novel, Boyfriend School, as it became a fantastically forgettable film, massively mediocre movie with deathless thespians, Steven Gutenberg. And so that was a great experience, and that happened 2 years prior, and I decided I was really not interested in screenplays, and I would stick to novels where you can control things, and have a director decide at some pivotal scene that he is going to have 10 Dolly Parton lookalikes parade across the screen. Can't compete with that. So, but I thought, this would be a great movie. I could write this story as a movie. I'm going to cough. I've coughed, as I promised. So I thought it would, the way to tell this story would be as a film, because then the story wouldn't belong to me. It would belong to the actors who portrayed the roles and the director. So I wrote it as a screenplay, and that essentially started a 10-year career for me as a screenwriter, because I told you it was a long story.
Yes, but I know parts of it, so.
Everybody take a drink. It was like, almost there. And so I had 10 years, a lot of interest in it, but the general wisdom that came down to me was there was the crossover audience, which had existed for Roots, no longer existed. So although I got many, many jobs, and I actually enjoyed screenwriting a lot, the film was never made, and I was quite sad about that. Put it aside, didn't think about it until 2015. And at that time, my wonderful youngest sister sent me a link to an article in Variety in which it was announced that Meryl Streep was trying to address the inequities, how few female stories are told and how few of them are told, how few women are behind the camera and writing the stories. So she was setting up a screenwriting contest for females over 40. And I made that, at that point, made that deadline by a sweet 25 years. So I submitted Kathy's screenplay and was one of the ones selected. So I went to a lab in upstate New York and met with directors and producers. But the most important thing, two important things. I revisited the story and realized I loved this story. And nobody had told it. It still had not been told. And so I had a lot of soul searching. And I asked myself, why are you not writing this? You wanted to write it for 40 years. Why are you not writing this? Because I'm scared. I'm scared of being criticized. And so I finally said, if you're not strong enough, brave enough to take a little bit of criticism, you probably don't deserve to tell Kathy's story. So I did, and the results have been very, very happy. It's a happy ending to this story. I have a wonderful African-American editor who was incredibly enthusiastic and has been very passionate, very committed to it. And at this point, I've done several events. I spoke in Houston, and a wonderful gentleman came up, showed me a picture of his father, and said, "My dad was a Buffalo Soldier." And then he gave me this pin. The Buffalo Soldiers were disbanded in 1951. I mean, it wasn't some. And then I spoke at the Dallas Museum of Art, and 5 Buffalo Soldier reenactors came, including a woman who has been doing Kathy for a very, very long time. Yeah, and she took my hands and looked got tears in her eyes and said, "Thank you for telling Kathy's story. We have known it in the community for a very long time, but you're bringing it to a wider audience." And and that was always my goal. So.
That was a great story. These authors, you know what? They're great storytellers. So okay.
But see I felt like I had to tell that because that explains the enlistment papers, the documentation I have about her. And then there's also, I found an article, she did an interview in the St. Louis Daily Times in 1876. And so that essentially is all the documentation, which is the very long explanation for why I decided I had to do it as a novel. There's not enough to, the glorious story I wanted to tell could not be told through the facts that exist.
Yeah, and what I found so interesting, and because I've read so many of your books, is just the story that you took us along. Like, for example, you probably had to come up with a creative way. So Kathy, in one part of the book, she has to go through a physical, and you have to come up with a way how she's going to get around that, because the men strip down for their physical. So how did you come up with all these ideas of how she existed in this man's world, especially when they hit the trail heading west and they had to live communally?
That was really a lot of fun. The 2 questions that popped into my head 40 years ago was, how did she pull it off? How did she pull it off? Because, you can almost, lots of women did this. I bet hundreds of women disguised themselves as men and served during both the Civil War and the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. But that was significantly easier for a number of reasons. The chaos of war and the constant, especially during the Civil War, where there were so many deaths and so many replacements and new faces. And they were also intense, frequently alone. But so they would carry, the soldiers carried their own tent, their little pub tent. So there was an enormous amount of privacy. But during in the regular army, this did not exist. They were in barracks. You were with a set regiment. You formed up with your unit, and theoretically you stayed together throughout the 3 years of your recruitment, your enlistment. And so I was always just fascinated about how did she pull it off? And you'll have to read to find out.
But did you make up all of those parts, or did you do some read other women's stories, or how did you? Because it was quite creative, Sarah. I have to say.
I read there are quite a few Civil War stories. They weren't super helpful because there wasn't fighting in this vast area, of Texas, where there's no cover. You can't go behind a tree. They don't exist. There's not enough cover, and so I had to cook something up. And honestly, I don't know. The major way that she did it was that nobody took their clothes off back then. In the true reality, she was in the infirmary 5 times and never discovered. So you can see the level of examination was not terribly thorough. But it was also fun imagining how she passed the physical exam, those kind of things.
Well, to me, that's when your storytelling enriches the existing story.
Yeah, oddly enough, I did a tremendous amount of research, but one of one of the books and films that helped me most is called Europa Europa, and it's the story of a Jewish boy during World War II who enlisted as a Nazi. And so he had to, it was that same level of jeopardy and danger of having his physicality exposed. And that really, I drew a lot from that, oddly enough. But there are several accounts of women, and there's a lengthy account of a female who passed herself off as a stagecoach driver for years in California. And the interesting things about all, those old-timey memoirs is they don't go into the details. You don't really get down like, how did you pee standing up or pull that up?
So you're not the first author of a nonfiction to say that their character, their person who had died, has spoken to them. We had Annette McGivney last year who wrote Pure Land, and the woman who she was writing about also spoke to her at length.
Lunatic?
No.
Crazy lady?
No. Channel. So did Kathy tell you that she was a daughter of a queen, or did you come up with that?
Essentially, the question of how she pulled it off occurred to me. And then the second question I had was, why, as far as we know, was she the only woman who made this choice? All women after the Civil War faced these incredibly desperate choices. And to our knowledge, Kathy Williams is the only woman who put on men's clothes and served, which was, vastly better than any other choices. And the answer I didn't realize it was the answer, but the title came to me, daughter of a queen. And to me, the obvious thing to draw from was that she had a grandmother who was an Amazon warrior, who was one of the what were called 6,000 warrior wives of King Gizo in Dahomey, this was, the fabled Amazon warriors. They were one of the great fighting forces, certainly in that area, and, really powerful.
Wives.
And, pardon?
6,000 wives?
King Gizo had 6,000 warrior wives, and she was one. They would send scouts out throughout the kingdom of Dahomey and find, the fiercest, strongest girls. Then they would come and, be married to the king. They never married. They devoted their lives to defending King Gizo and the kingdom of Dahomey. So I gave that to Kathy's grandmother. Kathy's grandmother passed it on to both her daughter and to Kathy, this kind of martial tradition and the knowledge that they weren't slaves, they were captives. They were prisoners of war, and it was their duty to seek freedom. So that, I had to figure out something to set her apart, why she did this.
So that helps move your narrative along, because she's got this within her, and it gives her strength and courage, and she can talk to her ancestors, just like some of your other characters have done in other books.
That's true. That's true.
And do we know if she was a marksman? I know she gets an award in the book. Do you know? We don't know.
We don't know that.
About,
we don't know that. And back to your initial question, she was actually in the infantry. She was a foot soldier, but from the very beginning, I had imagined, as we, if you think cavalry, if you think of the soldiers who were involved in the pacification of the West, you think of a soldier on a horse. And so I always wanted her, and I always felt Kathy wanted to be on a horse. I didn't want her to have to slog, as apparently she actually did, from where she trained at the Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis to her posting in southern New Mexico, so 1,200-mile march. I also did not want to put her in southern New Mexico. I visited both the places where she was posted, and they were made of adobe. So they have dissolved back into the earth, and there's really nothing to look at. Meanwhile, Fort Davis, fully restored, regimental headquarters, waiting. So I stationed her at Fort Davis.
Yeah, and then of course a lot of Buffalo soldiers are also in Fort Concho in San Angelo.
Fort Concho and Fort Clark was the home of the famous Black Seminole scouts who scouted for the Army.
Is it politically incorrect to refer to them as Buffalo Soldiers? I know that was a name we think that was given to them by the Indians. But I've wondered that. How do they feel, how do current African American?
They're very proud of the title, okay. And it's a bit of a myth that the Indians, Native Americans, gave this to them. Native Americans regarded them as just part of the force that had come to slaughter them. So there was, yeah.
Let's see, what else do I have to ask you about? So we know that, and so when the Civil War was over, can you tell us a little bit about how the recruiting of Africans happened to join up into these new? Well, there were already regiments in the United States Army, but there were how many African Americans were recruited to head west?
I should know that, and I don't.
Yeah, I know there are about 4 or 5 regiments. Like
there were 6.
There's 6.
There were initially 6. They were shrunk down to 4 at some point. There was a great push among African American leaders, particularly Frederick Douglass, who spoke extremely eloquently in favor of former slaves enlisting. And he has this magnificent quote, which I'm not going to get correct about. Once let the black man put upon his chest the brass eagle button and put a musket in his hand, let him defend this country, and no one can deny his right to citizenship. So that was inspiring in the fact that they got $13 a month.
Yeah.
Whereas, comparable wages, they would either, at that point, so the surrender at Appomattox happened essentially 5 days after Lincoln was assassinated. And immediately the betrayal of all that had been promised had begun already at that point. And the sharecropping system was, as you all know, was horrific. And so that was, you would essentially never have anything. And if comparable jobs, for example, you could work at a mill, a man could work at a mill full-time and he would make $4 or $5 a month. And the Army,
so this was
13.
Yeah, and you had room and board.
And
probably
a
pension, right? So
pension.
Did it propel African Americans to more stability, the ones who enlisted?
It did. It did. And they also quickly earned a reputation as being the most reliable, least likely to desert, essentially the highest quality recruits of any who went out west, because there was this huge contraction in the military after the Civil War. As at the end of this war particularly, where 1 in 5 families had dug a grave, put up a headstone, there was a lot of antipathy towards the military, and they was no public support for a peacetime military. So it shrank tremendously. And the people who then joined up, the whites, were typically, there were a lot of drunkards, a lot of former deserters, a lot of difficult cases, a lot of criminals. Meanwhile, the African Americans, that was the cream of the crop. Not only that, but as I'm certain you know, they had come from extremely harsh circumstances from slavery. So there was essentially no limit to how much discipline they would take and orders they would follow. So they ended up being the prize troops out west.
Mm-hmm. And did Sheridan actually come and visit her?
Right.
Okay, out west?
So this is an account that I got from Pam. And it's something I would like, if there are any historians in the crowd, it's something I'd like to pass on, that my friend Pam Black had an informant that she spoke to by phone. She took down the message, and her father, Barbara Richardson, this woman's name was, her father had lived at Kathy's boarding house towards the end of Kathy's life. She ran a boarding house in Trinidad, Colorado. And I was, this helped me form Kathy's story, this, from the tales that were passed on. I was very excited about this, but didn't really know how to pursue it. Pam and I could not get Barbara to meet with us. Then I was visiting my family in New Mexico, where my dad retired. And I went to the library where I had done a lot of undergraduate work and looked up. I was told that she had published something, but who knows if it had ever gotten it. So I looked it up, and there it was, like probably essentially the one copy any library held in the world of Barbara Richardson's Xerox little book. And in it, she repeats these stories she had heard about Kathy Williams. And the final line is, whenever Sheridan was out west, he always made sure to stop in and visit at Kathy's boarding house for her famous pecan pie, or rather sweet potato pie. Okay. Yeah. And but I haven't found that anywhere else. But I did. That to me was enough basis. He was military governor. And so it's not too far-fetched to think that they would have, he would have gone to visit the woman who had cooked for him throughout the Civil War. And it was a great gift because that is one of the essential arcs that goes through the entire book.
There's some credibility because, at least in the novel, when she's, has her boarding house, nobody really believes her. She's just this.
Yeah, and that, according to the stories, was true. She told this story about having served the Buffalo Soldiers, and so this was in Trinidad, Colorado, and she ran a boarding house for miners, very, very tough group, and they didn't believe her until Barbara Richardson's father came, and he had served in the military, and so he heard these stories, and he had enough prior knowledge to realize that she was telling the truth, and so he started writing them down in doggerel, this very rude form of poetry, which was mostly had to do with Kathy didn't give up no tail.
So we don't know if she married or had children.
She did marry. She married twice.
That's right.
Very short, unhappy marriages. Her last husband, he stole her pocket watch and $200, and she had him sent to jail.
And then on the back flap, there's a portrait of her. Is that, and how did you find it, and where is it? And
the portrait
is accurate.
The portrait on the back of the book, it's fictionalized. It's like it's like a picture of Jesus. We don't exactly know, but there are a lot of pictures of her. But this is the one that the Army uses on its website.
Okay.
So
that would make sense.
Yeah.
So now the Army uses it.
As long as the Army uses it, I'm not going to argue with the Army.
I'd like to open up the mic to questions from the audience to ask Sarah about this or anything else y'all would like. We can pass the mic around. Here we go. I'm hooked up to all these microphones, so I'm going to hand that to you.
Georgine. Yes, thank you. I'm interested in the markings that were on her chest and her mother's, and apparently.
Oh, I had so much fun to talk to people who've read the book. Wow. Thank you.
Where did that come from? Where did you?
Well, as you know, in Africa, many tribes use scarification to mark themselves or to mark the passage through puberty, and this I used as a way for Kathy's mother to pass on the warrior heritage to Kathy, and also it plays into the book later on.
I wanted to know what it looked like.
Yeah.
It looks like,
Tell me.
well, I describe it as like a line of pearls. And if you can, so I researched this, and there's a certain technique of scarification in which they make a little incision and then rub ash into it, or the juice of something quite caustic, and it will raise a little pearl. And so I used popular pattern in West African tribes of five lines of half a dozen of these little pearls right here. So can you see? It looks like this?
All right, Deanne.
I just want to know how to say grandmother's name.
Yeah.
In your mind, how
Yeah.
do you say it?
Yeah.
Yes.
You should listen to the audio version because wonderful. The narrator, I'm sorry, I cannot repeat. She actually does the correct pronunciation, and I am going to mess it up, so I'm not going to do that. I mean, I've always been committed to, I was at no point ever going to read a 19th century African American woman. And, but the narrator, I apologize.
I've just been trying to experiment with different ways to say it.
Yeah.
I'm going with her way. I was very, very fortunate with the audiobook. A wonderful woman named Bonnie Turpin, whom I heard, she read The Hate You Give, which has been made into a movie now. And I just fell in love with her. She just had that feistiness, that, kind of warrior spirit. So I advocated for her to be the reader. And they said, oh, I'm sorry, she's not available, but pick one of these other ones. And then I said, I really like Bonnie. And they said, well, good luck. One of her jobs fell out, so she can do it. And I have, I've heard that she did a marvelous job. I've never really been able to listen to any of my audiobooks, but...
I'll try to find it. I want to say that name.
Yeah.
I would try, but I would mess it up.
We've got some other questions?
I have one.
Oh, there's one there in the back, Sharon.
Whatever happened to the screenplay with Meryl Streep?
Everyone knows me that I can talk loud enough. Whatever happened to the screenplay with Meryl Streep, and do you think it will ever become a movie?
Let's all say a little prayer. if you would fold your hands and really believe.
But at this point, it really wouldn't be a biography, correct? It's more of a historical fiction?
This is historical fiction, absolutely. Yes, I'm not at any point maintaining. I call it a tribute in fiction. I'm not maintaining, like, as I say, we don't know enough. There is a nonfiction book about Kathy, and it's dull as dishwater. Because it's essentially just a history of that time and period, and I'm sure you've all read these history books, that the very speculative history who said, she probably would have, and, here's what somebody else was doing at that time. So, I don't know, I think it'd make a ripping good movie.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, we got one
I
here.
can probably just
Okay.
talk loud enough. Did Kathy come back to talk to you when you started working on it?
She asked if Kathy came back to talk to me. Not me, but my friend Pam. So Pam Black, who really lived with this for a very long time and did the essential research that she then passed on to me to verify this. I was extremely lucky, and when I had the launch event at the downtown library, it was just this dream of mine that I could talk to Pam about it. She lives in Rockport now, and she came up, and so we had this wonderful reunion, and I asked her, what do you think Kathy would think of this? And she got a big grin on her face, and she said, Kathy's told me she loves it. She just is somebody that needs to be known. She's a woman who did an extraordinary thing. She would be, as I say, and should be in the history books, as the first female to enlist in the peacetime U.S. Army, the regular peacetime. And when you Google that, her name should come up, and maybe at some point it will.
Does she have a wiki?
I wonder. I don't know. Maybe there's. A lot of people have done like pages about her. Not a lot, but if you look on all the documentation, if you Google Kathy or Cathay is popular, Cathay Williams documents, essentially all the documentation about her enlistment papers, her discharge paper, application for a pension, whatnot. An application for the pension is quite interesting because the doctor goes through and crosses out he and him and writes she and her and then they denied the pension.
She's here.
Yes?
Since you fictionized a lot of her life, Why didn't you end the book the way you did?
Oh, I'm not going to talk about the ending. I am not going to talk about the ending. No. Please. Be gone! Asking about the end of a book. If every single person had read, I would talk about it. But I'll whisper in your ear later.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the way Kathy wanted it ended. I can't.
Good. Question here and then a question over there.
So one of the things that you identified Kathy as, everyone thought that she was gay, and where did you come up with?
Now you've given away a major plot point. You two be gone. Anyone else of you show-off readers? Be gone. That becomes an element, let me just say. That becomes an element. Forget, like that Men in Black, erase. Yeah, it's, I always wanted to write just a cracking good yarn, something that, a 19th century feel to it, it is a 19th century book, and, I wanted to write a page turner, and so there are a lot of plot twists.
You really immersed yourself in the vernacular.
Oh, did I ever? My favorite topic. Oh my God, that was like my giant big hurdle. It's like I knew if I could not get Kathy's voice right, I was not going to write this. And I wanted to do a unique voice. I wanted hopefully one that we haven't heard before. That was a combination of the 19th century, which was really infused with the richness of the King James Bible, combined with things that sound, very ignorant to us, like they would say, clum instead of climb and things like that. But the expressions, there's just so many. I poured through 19th century documents and memoirs and articles and books. And Zora Neale Hurston was a great source. But I would pull out every expression that I hadn't heard. It's like, I've never heard this. This is great. But the first place that voice came from was when I was doing the research on the African American cowboys. And these cowboys used an expression, bum-fuzzled, which I had never heard it before. It's a country expression. But it's a 19th century country expression, as many of the, at that time, the country expressions were. But there were just so many I fell in love with. I just every time I found a great one, like, Kathy said, I wasn't raised in the woods to be scared by an owl. Just great things. And she said her mother didn't raise her for no short weight plowboy. Yeah. So things were like, they're really low, they're short weight, and that goes back to short people on the cotton weight and whatnot. Wish I could remember more. There's just so much fun. Yes. There's I made this whole giant compilation that have to use that. So thank you. That's probably what I'm proudest of is the voice, and because I also really wanted her to be Western. In this article, she said, I will never go back to the States, in which she was referring to the South essentially, and that she would always be in the West. So she's very definitely a Western woman, and I tried to edge it as much as I can into a Western kind of vernacular, as opposed to, beats my feet in the Mississippi mud kind of Southern thing, and yeah.
Okay, we got time for one more question. Okay.
If somebody else doesn't have, because it's my second one. I was really interested in how contemporary, in some ways, the relationships were for her with what I would call the mean, sexist, angry people who wanted to discover her, wanted to unleash open up who she was.
Right, right.
That felt to me very, very modern.
I have to agree. At this moment we're in, this moment, I feel it reflects. Kathy was living, that kind of essentially fear of men in packs. That we're raised with. That you have to understand. Maybe one and one, fine. Fear of the men in packs, and
there were good men.
Some were,
good,
not all.
But there were some real assholes.
Yeah, and having been raised in the military, I was raised with that beware, as it's just part of it, sinks into us as women. We're all raised with that, and it was very, very heightened in Kathy's case that literally she would have been killed if she'd been discovered. As it turned out, in this account, in the newspaper account, when she was discovered, she said, quote, all she said is, I was treated real bad. And in Barbara Richardson's account, she was raped. But she was also, she was a tall, rangy gal, and later, would keep minors in line with a, serious rape punch. So, she lived through it.
Okay, a few announcements. First of all, let's say thank you to Sarah for such a wonderful. This is just a little flyer takeaway for y'all if you would like to take that away. It's just some things about Austin. And our next guest is going to be Gay Gaddis on November the 13th. And she'll be here talking about cowgirl power. So we hope you join us for that. And again, there are books for sale at the bar. And then if you would like your books signed, we're going to kind of make a little space here. And Sarah will sign your books if you brought them or bought them here.
To anybody you want. Merry Christmas, Happy Birthday.
Yeah, they make great holiday gifts, obviously.
I'm sorry. Please. I
don't
know what your message is. I'll write it.
And thank you so much for braving the traffic and the weather to be here. Thank you.